Let's talk about color. To begin with, it's probably easiest to talk about it from a purely theoretical point of view. Because I think it's one of the hardest things to learn, and it's one of those things that probably can be sort of equated to a talent. And we also really have to take in the real consideration that some people have different forms of color blindness, which makes it harder or easier to sort of tell what's going on in the color world. But I will say that I do know people who are professional artists who you probably wouldn't think are colorblind. People who deal extensively with color, so it's not necessarily the complete crippling disadvantage that you might think, but it definitely means that if you are sort of red-green colorblind or some form of colorblind, I've had people who obviously were seeing completely different things to what I was seeing when they're looking at the color wheel. It's something that if that is an issue for you, you absolutely need to tackle it head on. You can't be a bit like, oh, no. You have to be very clear that, look, I'm colorblind. This is going to be a problem unless I overcome it. And the way that you overcome it is by learning the theory maybe a lot more than someone who is going to sort of mess around with color in an intuitive way. You really have to understand these numbers up here, this hue, saturation, and balance. You have to understand the anatomy of color. You have to understand simple color schemes that you know will work. You need to know things that absolutely won't work. So we'll talk a little bit about those, but in general, for most people, it's either kind of you have a color sense or you don't, or sometimes you know some things work, some things don't. Sometimes it's just like every color you pick is sort of wrong. There's a whole spectrum of sort of instinct when it comes to color. But in the same way that perspective is one of those things where lots of people kind of know the rules, but that still doesn't necessarily equate perfectly to being able to create great color schemes. Color is similar. Most people have seen the color wheel. I imagine that most of you have seen the color wheel and that you understand the basic concept of color theory. And that is basically just that we've got these colors and they're kind of arranged on this wheel, and there's sort of a color wheel, and a lot of this is based on color mixing, which we don't really have to deal with because a lot of sort of what is next to each other and how you get color is based on sort of how you're mixing paint. But we don't really have to deal with that quite so much. But it is really actually very interesting and important to at least consider that, that a lot of simple color schemes are actually based on simple color combinations, and that probably, as with many things in digital art, often the greatest benefits are also at the same time the greatest weaknesses. And just because we have sort of unlimited power to choose any color, that often means that we have just more ways to shoot ourselves in the foot and create a terrible color scheme. That really is the case. In the same way that, just using Control Z and undoing just means we can keep making mistakes all night long without learning from them potentially. So yeah, we can pick any color in Photoshop. We can pick any color we want. You can get exactly that color. Not all those colors will print. Not all those colors will display in all situations. Color changes from monitor to monitor, but essentially we can pick any color, and that means we have, if there's like 16 million colors or something in sort of a standard RGB space, yeah, there's 16 million ways that you can pick the wrong color and make it look awful. The choice really doesn't help us. It's much more about actually limiting, and as you'll see, probably the more you limit, the better things will get. But just to talk initially about some of this color theory, we have a color wheel, and The color wheel is useful because it sort of shows us these different, the kind of different spectrum of color, but also the way that colors oppose each other on this color wheel is useful because these things actually create different color harmonies and schemes. So the basic idea is we have our primary colors like red, sort of blue, yellow, and then you've got your secondary colors like green, purple, sort of orange. And what happens is that our sort of primary colors are opposite secondary colors, and if you combine them, you get what's called a complementary color scheme. So this would be something like red and green complements, sort of blue and kind of like an orange complements. And again, you've kind of got yellow and like a purple are complements. And that means that they kind of work well together. They vibrate off each other. And often really quite nice color schemes are based off a complementary color scheme. These are kind of opposing each other and they work well together. So in general, kind of remember these. But in the same way that I would say like a complementary color scheme, it can also be, it is the same if you're mixing between basically like any, or using as your color scheme, any colors which are opposite each other on the color wheel. So even if you're picking these sort of tertiary, like sort of secondary colors, they're also going to be sort of, and again, this is not the best color wheel, but just sort of using it as an example because these colors are pretty much identical. Whereas that one, I think should be more sort of more around there or something. But anyway, just you get the general idea. Like a blue-purple can mix with kind of, a yellow-orange, and that in itself will be sort of a complementary color scheme. And so, yeah, remember the complements. And that's simply because complements actually enhance each other. If you put a bit of red in near some green, it'll make the red feel redder, and vice versa. They just kind of vibrate against each other, but they don't vibrate against each other as much as kind of contrasting primary colors. So a contrasting color would be like sort of red and blue. And red and blue, when they're together, really kind of sort of bounce off each other. You can see, if you're looking at this and the video recording is not too bad, you can see literally like sort of where these two meet. It's kind of like it vibrates a bit. Your eye is a bit like, what's going on? So yeah, red and green. Red and blue is kind of like a good sort of contrasting color scheme. And there's others if we kind of go like blue and yellow. Again, is a sort of an example of like and the kind of red and yellow, I think would be considered a like a contrasting color scheme. These are primary colors. We're mixing them together, and they're quite striking. They're less likely to kind of they still vibrate, but they vibrate in a much harsher way, so that it's really obvious to see that they're kind of separate. So you can see the sort of relationships between these. So yeah, some of these go together better than others. And So those are sort of two ones that you really have to keep an eye out for, because contrasting colors often look awful together because there's so much vibration and you're really noticing it. But it can be useful if you are really after that kind of punchy effect. Complementary colors are probably the easiest way to go. It's a safe bet. You get a lot of visual interest, but they complement each other. They're not contrasting. They're not screaming for attention. So the other thing that's probably really good to think about is the concept of harmonious colors. And they're just basically colors which are kind of next to each other and create kind of a harmony. So say if you take sort of three colors that are next to each other and sort of, like create a color scheme out of that, then they're going to be sort of harmonious. There's going to be less sort of contrast. And again, these colors on this wheel are not necessarily the best examples, but a harmonious color scheme is sort of three colors, or more or less, two next to each other. Again, there are rules for this, but I'm just giving you sort of very general sort of guidelines. And what this is good for is making a very sort of peaceful, harmonious color scheme, one that is going to vibrate way less than everything else. And the general idea is that each of these types of kind of color combinations will tend to sort of suit the mood or the image that you're going for. So, another one that is kind of, maybe sort of overlooked, but is actually very important to understand when it comes to color theory is the concept of like a monotone color scheme, which is, probably where you would sort of have sort of two that are next to each other, or just sort of one kind of color and maybe varied a bit. So again, it might be sort of green and like a blue-green or something. And so that would be considered like a monotone. So let's just quickly have a look at how we can sort of just spot these kind of color schemes and what's going on when we actually look at images. So if you look at like a Howard Pyle image and illustration, again, it's mostly sort of blue and it's got a few of these kind of yellows in it. So it's sort of blue, green, and yellow. So if we sort of look at our sort of color theory thing, it's kind of like blue, green, yellow. It's kind of almost like harmonious sort of color schemes. And there's not a lot of yellow in it. It's mostly sort of a white, but the yellow is sort of given as a bit of a, it's going to give it a little bit of punch. But in general, this is kind of almost like a monotone sort of color scheme. And we've also got this sort of red in here and a bit of red sort of there. And so you've got this blue. It's almost like blue, red, yellow. So it's, it's kind of like a primary color scheme a little bit, but in general, it's kind of just mostly blue. You'd say probably like 90 in terms of color. You've got some sort of some reds in there. But in general, it's mostly blue with these kind of warm whites. And obviously these kind of like warm sort of white grays in there, and it's very hard to tell exactly what sort of color would be here because this is a poor reproduction probably of a printed image which is quite old, so it can be hard to sort of tell, but that's kind of what's going on. It's mostly blue. There's some warms in here, there's some reds, we've got these kind of white sort of grey, like warm greys in there. And they're not that warm, but relative to the blue, they're warm. So you kind of start to get a feeling for like what is happening in this image color-wise. Let's look at something else. This is like a Sargent painting, and you can see again it's sort of mostly red. So probably like very sort of a monotone image, red and kind of yellow. So again, there's not a lot of color happening in terms of color scheme, but it's a very strong color. But it would be more like a harmonious red sort of like orangey sort of scheme. If we look at this, we've kind of got some blue. This is another Sargent painting. Got a lot of blue and some sort of yellows in here. And so it's kind of blue, yellow, and white. White doesn't really sort of affect the color quite so much, but you kind of have some warm whites and some cool whites. So it's sort of blue and yellow really is mostly what's going on there. And of course you've got some sort of red lips and some redder sort of accents in here, which are really going to pop out. You can see sort of against this blue, that red is really kind of vibrating again because they're sort of contrasting colors. So here's a Zorn painting, and this is pretty much monotone, more or less. There's not a lot of color in there. It's mostly just kind of warm grays, blacks, reds, definitely just kind of on the, red-yellow kind of spectrum. Let's look at a few. This is a Maxfield Parrish illustration. Again, we're talking about blue, yellow, orange on these kind of tones, and there's a lot of color in here. So color-wise, that's kind of, again, sort of blue and yellow. So there's sort of really contrasting colors. There's a lot of impact there. You can see it really sort of jumps out on the page. This one is kind of a little bit similar. See if we can zoom up. Again, some of these are not quite as detailed as others. But, we kind of have yellow grays, warm grays, and a lot of these blue sort of cool shadows. Obviously, a lot of sort of warm, neutral tones, but still there's that same sort of color going on there, that sort of blue and yellow vibe. It's just much more sedated. This one would kind of be sort of, again, monotone, like warm sepia tones. This is, again, similar sort of contrasting colors. We've got yellows and blues. So primary blue, primary yellow, they're really going to vibrate. You can really tell. And it's kind of a lot of orange as well, obviously. And again, this one is one that's scanned from this is by the Hildebrandt brothers. And this obviously represents that Lord of the Rings scene. This was done a long time before the movies. So yeah, you can see there's definitely that's kind of, there's not a lot of color variation going on within objects and stuff, but there's a massive color shift to the sort of inside areas and sort of cool outside areas. And again, the contrasting colors, lots of impact, really sort of strong. Whereas this is more sort of harmonious colors. We've got sort of greens, yellows, some very sort of green blues in there, but mostly sort of green, yellow. Again, if we look at our color wheel, it's kind of like around here, around this kind of side of things. And obviously, there's some reds in there as well that are going to make it pop. Lots of kind of quite vibrant colors, but that's kind of what's happening. That's kind of where it's sitting in space, in the color space. So here we've got sort of, again, and it's important to understand that when we kind of say monotone, often we might be thinking about something which is sort of very sort of almost grayscale, there's not much color in it. But also when we look at an image like this, which also it's sort of close to being a monotone image, there is actually a lot of color variation going on. So it's kind of primarily a sepia image, but we also have some sort of purpley blue, like cool colors going on here. And we've got, this kind of red, which really, the red says that we can put color in here if we want, but we're just not going to. And you can see there's some sort of reds in the background. There's a lot of vibration going. So there's a lot of sophisticated color going on here if you look closely, although on initial inspection, this kind of image is monotone. And I think you'll find this with a lot of kind of old master paintings, is that a lot of them work within that tone simply because color was, a real commodity back then. Getting color and actually producing those sort of, crazy bright colors was quite tricky. And certainly paint technology advanced. But to begin with, and certainly, as a tradition, there was a long tradition of sort of being quite subtle with color, because, it wasn't possible to have this sort of color when, obviously this was sort of done in the, sort of 70s, around there, somewhere like that. And, we've got all these sort of modern colors where you can really have a blue and an orange, and it's kind of quite acceptable. Whereas, back in the day, if you're talking about like, especially like a Zorn painting where we're using a very limited palette almost on purpose, most of it is sort of monotone, but we still have some quite little accents of color. We've got some green and some red to kind of bring it to life a little bit. There's some green in here. Obviously there's warmer sort of reds in the violins. There's some reds in the hand. So again, it's sort of, but there's no purple in this image, for instance. There's no blue. It's sort of green and red, and that's kind of what's going on. Just subtle accents. Here, this is kind of somewhat of like, a harmonious color scheme as well. We've kind of got these like warm sepia tones with like a very sort of subtle tint of green and this kind of blue standing out. So he really stands out, whereas they all kind of blend in. They're very harmonious, kind of yellow, green, sort of orange, and he's kind of on the other side of the spectrum. So they're kind of sort of like around here, and then he's almost like on the other side. So it's important to understand, and we'll get back to looking at some of those color schemes, but it's important to understand that it's never quite as simple as like, a complementary color scheme equals like this color and this color. It's generally saying that sort of colors that are operate opposite each other will sort of complement each other, and these contrasting sort of colors, which are sort of, the primaries and stuff, they're really going to go like bang. You're going to notice it, that sort of blue yellow. It's really going to be quite extreme. And again, if you want things to kind of be more harmonious and again, sort of feel less like there's less urgency, like, it's a bit more natural and stuff, then you just kind of use things that are sort of next to each other on the color wheel. And again, if you want something that sort of doesn't have a lot of color in it, then you just sort of use, maybe one or two colors that are sort of next to each other, and don't really worry too much about the color itself. For the majority of the painting, again, what you need to look at is sort of what's the percentage of different colors in an image. If you just sort of look at it as a thumbnail and say like, is it 80% this color, 10% this color, what's going on? What's happening? So that's kind of the best way to think about the color wheel, the color theory, is just you can sort of get different effects by combining colors in different ways. And generally, if you don't combine them this way, if we just kind of pick random colors and we pick too many colors, then it's going to look awful. That's generally the rule, is if you pick too many of these colors or use all the colors, it's going to be sort of tricky. So just kind of keep it simple, pick 2 or 3 colors, and, think about the sort of scheme you're having and the percentage of, if you have sort of, 80% of your painting and you're going to have a lot of color in it, then, you're going to want sort of 80% to, and it's a complementary scheme. You're going to want 80% of your painting to be sort of in that complementary sort of range where we're sort of opposite the color wheel. You might have a few other little bits and pieces if you want to kind of pop them out or something, but in general, yeah, use these things to your advantage to plan your image, to plan what's going to be in focus, what's not going to be in focus. Because yeah, it's important to have contrast. This is one of those rules which is kind of probably underpins all art, really. Make sure you have contrast in all things. And I think one of the big traps that we fall into when we're starting, especially with Photoshop, is that you can just kind of punch up the contrast and just like turn it all the way up, with contrast and brightness sort of adjustments. And what you'll find is that contrast doesn't just mean making the light lighter and the dark darker until it's kind of your eyes bleed. Contrast is having a mix of sort of sharp and very vibrant things, and a mix of things which are more sublimated. So sort of a mix of hard edges and soft edges. It's not necessarily just about, hard edges, black and white next to each other. It's about the contrast of contrast itself with a lack of contrast. That's how you really draw the eye, and it'll appear that there's more contrast than there is. So that's contrast in colors. Again, if you have too many colors, you might say, there's lots of color contrast. No, there's no contrast, because we can't tell something from something else. It's information overload, and that doesn't necessarily automatically mean contrast. You have to often be quite subtle with it. So again, you can see this when we start to study paintings, but this is something you need to keep in your mind. You need to keep it. This is as objective as can get with art, is that most rules are actually about contrast, and it's just balance, sort of yin yang, etc. Anything which is in too extreme kind of falls apart. If something you just sharpen filter, it's lost. Doesn't matter. The images, you have no contrast. It's like if someone's screaming at you, they lose impact. And it's sort of defeating the purpose of trying to draw attention to themselves. So yeah, if something is not going right, I think it can often be simply traced back to contrast. Is there enough contrast in this? And that's like, there's global contrast, there's small contrast, there's contrast across the whole image, contrast in the color scheme, contrast in values, contrast in everything. But what you'll find is that in addition to these, probably the easiest way to think about color in general is just that we're talking about warm versus cool. Because again, if you remember, a lot of the rendering advice is about sort of light and dark. And when we add color, often what's happening is that we're getting a differentiation between the light source and whether or not that light source is cool or warm, and whether or not that sort of light source is creating shadows which are cool or warm. Because generally there's a contrast, and if there's not a contrast, we kind of tend to want a contrast between warm and cool in our shadows and highlights. And that can either mean that we have a cool light with warm kind of shadows, or vice versa. We've got a nice bright light and we've got sort of cool shadows. And different types of light will generally influence other shadows. So a really warm light will often mean that there's blue, cooler shadows, simply because the grayness of a shadow is relatively going to appear cool when you have it sort of surrounded by all this warm sort of yellow light. So warm versus cool is probably the most important thing. And definitely if you're in any way colorblind or in any way sort of challenged in this way, just think in terms of warm versus cool, and that's what will give you the pop. That's what will give you the impact in an image, is that we can see a separation between the highlights and the shadows, and that's actually helping us to read the form, not confusing it. So we'll talk a lot about this later, and definitely when we sort of look at, again, we were talking about some of those images which are kind of monotone. Again, often what's happening here is we've got sort of warm sort of highlights, and we've got these sort of cooler shadows and cooler areas, and those cool areas are really going to sort of, again, like complement, contrast each other. They're going to vibrate, and we're going to see a difference that is perhaps more of a difference than the value itself indicates, which is really what we're after in color, is to control a contrast and a separation between light and dark, or what are we supposed to look at versus what we're not supposed to look at, i.e. what's in focus in an image versus what's not. The contrast of these colors, even if it's not in a scheme, if it's just about warm and cool, is what we're trying to do. We're trying to control where does the eye look with color. So the most basic is just warm, cool. And again, that's often what we're sort of trying to do with all of these images, is just try and say, what should we look at? What's kind of important? What's standing out? So, here we've kind of got this green image, and in the middle we've sort of got this red, which again is a complementary color scheme. A red sort of house in the middle, you're going to look at that. That's kind of what we're trying to do. And again, here we've kind of got this sort of harmonious color scheme, which there's not much vibration here. There's a lot of value in this image. Obviously, it's sort of almost monotone. There's not a lot of color, but this guy is standing out way more because Waterhouse, not we, but Waterhouse is controlling where we're looking, because we've got this, and again, it's sort of like this sort of warm yellow green, but this guy's blue. And there's not that much blue anywhere else. You can see there's some accents here and there and a little bit of blue, but he's standing out because he's different, and that is intentional. And the red scarf is meaning that this blue is vibrating a lot more. It's going to look a lot more blue than it would if there was no scarf there. And so this is just color is working for the artist in the image to make sure that everything makes sense, and that this whole thing is kind of looking sort of, as he wants. And you can see, if you look at it as a thumbnail, you can really see that red little mark there. That's quite, color-wise, it's really coming together. And even though his robe is sort of, sublimated massively, it kind of blends into everything, you can still see it. You can still tell that he's kind of different. Like, the color of his skin is different to their skin. It's kind of, lots of, even though, again, you look at this and you say it's mostly monotone, there's a lot of subtlety there. There's a lot of sophistication going on in the details. And that's often what you kind of had to do, because we didn't have, at that point in time, there probably was, but didn't necessarily have all the colors, and certainly not the same amount of colors as you would have had sort of, in the, early 1900s with Maxfield Parrish, or again in the 1970s with the Hildebrandt brothers, where you can sort of use any color and you can do these sort of things. So it had to be more about sophistication, and probably the sophistication is probably closer aligned with getting things to look sort of photoreal, if that makes sense, because often we don't see that much color, in the same way that if we look at this image, this is not necessarily what reality looks like, but it looks very appealing. It's very interesting to our eye, but it doesn't appear realistic in the same way that some of those other sort of more subtly painted images do. The same with this. It's very it's an abstraction of color and reality, and that's very, very appealing and works really well. But it's all about sort of what the end result you want is and how you want it to feel. But yeah, definitely if you're kind of interested in doing concept-y paintings, and often things are a lot more desaturated, you have to think a lot more about value than color in terms of how you're going to make things read. But we still need to understand color theory to get this level of sophistication happening. There's a lot of color theory in here, even though, again, you might just look at it and say, it's just kind of a monotone image. It wouldn't work as well. It wouldn't vibrate as well if there wasn't these warms and cools and this kind of stuff happening. It wouldn't be a painting. Do you know what I mean? It'll just be it's a picture of some people doing some stuff. But this really makes it mean something, because our eye is going to sort of be drawn around the page. So yeah, warm versus cool is probably more important than color theory in terms of, if your painting is not working, check contrast, check warm versus cool. If that's kind of working and your values are right, you've got warm versus cool. Normally things will kind of look okay, and then we can sort of start to think about color theory. And like I was saying, how kind of color improved and the use of color sort of improved in terms of the experimentation and what was going on. A lot of that was just down to technology, technology of pigment. And you really saw that when we had the kind of the Impressionist movement. So previously, I think the bottom, this is a Monet, and this is a sort of a Rembrandt, and probably they both sort of typify the different ends of that scale. Where Rembrandt probably didn't have the same level of color to play around with, and was really more concerned with light and dark and making things really sort of punchy. And you can see that with like many of the sort of images that he sort of made. We'll see if we can find a few more. So again, so this is kind of a Monet sketch where things are a lot more blocky. We're playing with color. This is another sort of Monet image, a bit different to the sort of, the typical water lilies and stuff. This is a Monet where we're playing with a lot of color. The details are less important. There's less sort of a feeling of light via light and dark. There's nothing here which is really, really dark, but there's a lot of sort of feeling of light in the image. And that was quite tricky to do when you didn't have that amount of color to work with. So when you're dealing with sort of a Rembrandt or, a lot of the more tonalist sort of images, if we can find some, you're really sort of dealing with, again, there's lots of color in this image, but we're dealing much more with kind of light and dark, and sort of how that is going to give us a sense of lighting and drama and a feeling that things are kind of real. So, if you compare that to kind of like a Monet, where there's a lot more playing with color to get a feeling of the light being there. This is a Rembrandt. Everything's sort of, it's very light and dark. And there's sort of two different techniques that were sort of, developed to take advantage of the different technology of pigment that's available. But the contrast between them is still very interesting, and I think it's important to consider that basically one is more than the other relying on color, and one is more than the other relying on value to represent form. And obviously a tonalist is more concerned with tone, and this is more like a monotone. Again, this is more what you have to deal with if you're doing sort of more photorealistic concept art paintings or something that's kind of gritty. You don't have much color in there, but you do have light and dark to play with, and that's what we use in lieu of color to represent form and show light. But what you do have is that when we have color, we can actually not use quite the same degree of light and dark contrast, but we can use the contrast inherent in combining colors to actually represent the way that light falls on things and the way that light feels. And so what's happening with an Impressionist is that we're amping up the differences in color contrast to represent kind of, again, like an exaggeration of reality that's kind of quite interesting, in the same way that someone like Rembrandt is amping up the feeling of sort of light and dark to really get a sort of a heightened feel of reality there, and a good sort of an excellent way to sort of really focus your eyes. Everything's black in the background, and we just got this massive, really bright white kind of light head that's just jumping off the page, this is a really important consideration to make, because I think that there is an inherent, sort of dichotomy between and division between sort of how complex an image is and sort of how simple you often need to make the color scheme. And so what you often find is that if an image is quite simple, like, here's another sort of Monet where it's just kind of a woman sitting down, But because of the sophistication of color usage and the amount of color and the way that it's being used quite liberally, it actually makes this, and you see you've got this kind of pinks on here, which are, when you zoom out, it actually gives it an amazing sense of, and I'm sure if you saw the original, it would be even more amazing sense of space and light in there. And that's mostly done by color. There's not much difference between the values here. It's mostly color difference. And again, you've got these greens, these reds, these kind of pinks in here. And that's what's giving it that really nice, interesting sense of being a painting. Do you know what I mean? It's not just an observational painting. It's a piece of art because those color hints that are there are being amplified by the artist to show that form. And I think what you would find is that if you also added a lot of value contrast, what you have is, again, a lack of contrast because we're having the value really representing light and shade and the color really representing light and shade. And it's kind of too much information. It's too much contrast. And what we want is a balance of contrast. So the idea is you need to be very subtle with the way you represent form. And sometimes, again, we can do that not by necessarily purely using value in the way that we would with our spheres and cubes, but also by incorporating the concept of maybe one face being a different color to another, and that contrast in itself tricking our mind into seeing that form and saying, oh, this is this side and this is this side. This is facing this side because it's this different color. And that's how you're getting all these reflected colors and all that kind of thing going on. And although you can always, if you understand this dichotomy, you can very much kind of thread that needle and get it kind of exactly right. In general, I think what you'll find is that a more complex image is better served with kind of a simpler color scheme, and certainly a more sort of complex image in terms of the level of rendering and sort of light that's in there. If you're going to use sort of a lot of contrast, you want like a lot of bright colors. Often the image itself needs to be simpler. And a really good way of sort of seeing this as well is if you look at a lot of modern cartoons and those kind of designs, the designs are very simple, but the colors are quite bright. And if you take that color out, the whole thing kind of starts to fall apart a bit. Versus, if you take something like sort of Gears of War or a very kind of black and white sort of game design, if you take out the contrast from that, and don't play it up quite as much, then it's kind of just looks really gray, like there's nothing there. There's no color in there, so there needs to be a lot of value. So yeah, complex image often needs a simple color scheme. And I think that the grittiness and the amount of detail that's in something like Gears of War really works with like a monotone color scheme. Whereas, something like a cartoony Zelda style game really works with a lot of color in there. And you'll see, if you look at like Zelda as an example, the simpler Zeldas are more colorful, whereas the ones that are more realistic and are more detailed have maybe more texture but less color in there. And there's just a kind of a sliding scale of these things where the amount of sort of lighting and detail you have often requires you to kind of sort of just tone back the color a little bit so that you can make it feel a little bit more realistic and like it's kind of working. But just from an interest point of view, we can still make a painting very interesting by applying a lot of color theory to it and being very sophisticated with the color, even if the image itself is quite simple. So here, see, again, it's just a very simple image, but our eye is bouncing all over the place because there's so much color information there. There's so much interesting stuff happening. And that's because these places, instead of them being different objects and things and stories, they're different colors. Whereas this one, our eye is bouncing all over the place, our eye is occupied, but it's because there's different values and different arrangements of kind of very stark tones and things, and we can actually look around. And we don't necessarily need heaps of color in here to occupy our eye. And maybe if we did, it would be sort of too much. It'd be like, that's like, it's not interesting enough. There's not enough sort of areas of repose in there. It's sort of too much. So yeah, often think about sort of what kind of, and the best way to do this is if you're interested in completing or executing a particular type of image, look at how other people have approached that same image. Look at how much color they're putting in them. And if they are kind of combining these two things, then pay very, very close attention to how they're doing it. And don't assume that that's necessarily like a natural kind of easy thing to do. Yeah. And probably like lastly, again, this is one of those things that we kind of all know and we've heard about, but is probably the key to all color is that color and value are relative. They're relative to each other. And you'll see this when you're rendering the cubes and things, is that often, getting that feeling of light being in there requires picking certain values, and those values are often not what we might imagine they are. So we use that concept of like halfway to black, and that sort of means we get very close to, okay, this is like an arrangement of values. But often, it's important to understand that values are relative, but color is also very relative. So this is, again, these are the same colors, but because this one is in shadow, but it's not sort of, it's not like it's actually been placed in shadow, it's just the same color. It sort of feels like it's, and again, if we maybe sort of tried to put it in shadow, I think this is just one of those examples from Wikipedia. If we try and put it in shadow, it's going to maybe like sort of slowly at some point maybe feel like it's the same kind of value, maybe not, but they're the same exact color. You can see that it's not moving, but we just assume that if this color was in shadow, it would be darker. So this one, because it's in shadow, our eye says, this must be really bright. But in fact, it's exactly the same. And it's the same here. If you look at this sort of for long enough and you kind of focus on some of the colors, what you'll find is that these gray squares, which again are all sort of the same type of gray, will start to have slightly different color casts if you look at it sort of long enough. And again, it won't be sort of totally marked, but it is important to see just on a very subtle level that often things will appear sort of slightly different. Certainly things will appear sort of darker or lighter or et cetera, depending on sort of what background they're on. So yeah, the color and value are relative. This is something you really have to see. You have to look at paintings and understand kind of how they're put together, because otherwise it's very hard to sort of say, like, what is that pink? Like, what is it going to be? Versus what is this blue? Do you know what I mean? And these are actually quite strong color shifts. You can see there's not a huge shift in value between these two, but there's a big shift in the hue. And that, again, is more to do with an Impressionism style. Whereas most of the colors along here, even though these ones along here are sort of going to appear really sort of warm, and if we use the color thing, we can see, yep, they're kind of quite sort of warm and yellow. If we look at these ones up here, you can see they're not changing in terms of hue. The hue stays around 33, but... And you can see even if we go sort of in here, we're still going to like 20, and this is a very different color to sort of something like here. But, these colors in here, like this is a 30, which is sort of a bit more red, whereas this one is sort of like 24. But the color difference between sort of this bit and this bit visually is quite distinct because of the change in saturation. So this is like yellow, orange, and this is still yellow-orange, but it just doesn't have much color in it. It's much less saturated, it's much darker. And so that's really giving us this massive difference in contrast. Whereas if we look up here and look at an Impressionist painting, we've got a blue, all right? And again, 15% saturation, 60% sort of value, and then we look at a pink. You can see the saturation is changing a little bit, but the hue is jumping. This is actually pink. It's not relative pink. It's actually pink. This is actually blue, and that's what's creating that. Like, there's a distinct difference between these two colors. Like this is a crazy pink, and this is like a very cool, sedated blue. Again, like this is really green. So you're seeing like massive jumps around the color spectrum in the image. And again, it's hard to say what the actual colors would be because this is a scan that's been resed down and et cetera, et cetera. But there is actually marked differences in the hue of these images, which are more impressionist. Whereas most of the colors in here, if we sort of go around, you'll see this is kind of hovering around here, like sort of 20 to 30. So we're going all around here, and every now and then it'll kind of pop out. But in general, that's kind of where it's staying. You know, and you go down here, and again, it's still like a 10. That's that bright red. You go right next to it, and this is, yeah, it's still, the hue is not changing. And that's because we need to break down the elements of color and say there's 3 elements of color really that are important to pay attention to. If you have your color palette open in Photoshop, we can look at changing it to be HSB, which is hue, saturation, and balance. Balance really means value when it comes to color. And so this is the hue. This is like, which tube of paint is it, basically? Is it the red one, the pink one, blue, yellow? This is like which tube of paint it is, okay? And then this one, the saturation, is maybe like how much white is in the image, okay? Like how saturated is that image? Is it like a pastel-y pink? Still might be pink, but there's a lot of white mixed in it. It's like a pastel, very faded, faint pink. And the B, or the balance, is kind of black. You know, this is value. This is like how much black have I mixed with this color. And so obviously if you mix a lot of black and white, what you're mixing is gray with your color. So you get a very sort of desaturated version of that color. And what we can do is that we can say, even though this might be the same tube of paint right here, I've got it's tube of paint, but there's not much black mixed with it. There's not much white mixed with it. It's pretty much like just straight out of the tube. Whereas this one over here has got a lot of gray mixed with it. And what that does, because gray is sort of, and if it is like a cool gray, which it probably was, but even if it's a warm gray, relative to this red, even though it's the same sort of color, it's got so much gray mixed with it that relative to each other, they appear very different. And there's a big contrast, which is what we're after. And that shows us that, you know, well, for instance, it shows, you know, this is in shadow versus this being in light. But it also sort of shows that, you know, there's a big, we can really see that red, whereas this is not so apparent. And, you know, again, these sort of images are, it's the same tube, but, you know, there's sort of a lot of white mixed with that, only a little bit of black. So we've kind of got a, you know, a light gray mixed with it here. And that's kind of giving us this sort of tone. Whereas here, again, we're sort of, this is that same sort of color, but again, with a bit more stuff mixed in. And again, if you look at the blacks, it's the same kind of color. Whereas if we look over here, what you'll see is that, and often with this, with a toneless painting, that is literally because the artist is using a very limited palette. There might be, you know, like maybe 2 or 3 tubes of paint here, and frequently it's like a very good white, a very good black, and a kind of a sepia tone of some variety, and everyone has their own sort of thing that mixes right for them, different artists, different paints, because often when you're mixing in paint, it's actually a chemical reaction. It's not in Photoshop, is that you mix 2 paints together, and actually it's a chemical reaction that makes sure that, you know, on the color wheel, you know, if you mix sort of these primary colors, you know, like blue and yellow, that you kind of get the green, which, you know, is kind of weird, but it's a chemical reaction. Whereas in Photoshop, you know, if you sort of mix those two, it's kind of, you know, if we kind of get sort of a blue out of the tube. Color. Just make the opacity right. So yeah. And sort of a yellow, like a really bright yellow, and we kind of mix them together. You know, you kind of get a green in there as you overlap them. But yeah, these things are sort of work quite drastically when it's actually a chemical reaction, and different paints would kind of react differently to each other. So everyone would have their own sort of set of colors and what would be happening. But you can see even here where we've sort of got a green, it's a very sort of similar value. It's kind of a 50, so it's much more like yellow, but it looks green just because of the relativity of it. So there might have been only a handful of, literally a handful of tubes of color used to create this painting. And that's a very good way of just working with warm cools, and that's what we're doing, just warm cools, combining them, creating contrast, creating form, showing light. Whereas here, if I again just move my thing all over the place, you're going to see there's like that hue. This slider is kind of going all over the place. It's like, here we're in reds, now we're actually going over here. We're still kind of in yellows, but now this is actual green. It's not relative green, it's actual green. And here we go over here, and it's sort of even more sort of actual green. Still not as green as you might imagine. It's looking very green because it's placed on all these reds and it's kind of vibrating. And again, you have that complementary thing going because we've got two different colors next to each other. And what's happening is they're vibrating on the page on a very subtle level. Like you have green that's brushed over a warm color. So it's vibrating on like, in this case, sort of on a pixel to pixel level. But if it's pigment, it's like bits of small pigment on a canvas texture is kind of right next to another type of pigment. And they vibrate against your eye. Your eye tries to tell the difference, and it's vibrating like red, green, red, green, red, green. And that's much more interesting and much more vibrant. Your eye's active. So that's why it probably appears more green than it is, because, it's not sort of green, blue-green, but it does appear very green because it's vibrating. But yeah, and again, you've sort of got pinks. So there's pinks, blues, greens, no purple, but apart from that, most of the color spectrum is kind of covered to some degree. Again, not quite as that extreme because some of them are very sublimated sort of pastel colors. In this one, we sort of got lots of white mixed with these. So they're kind of, appearing quite subtle. And again, I don't want to get too confused. There's no advantage to really considering it as like, I'm mixing white with my pure color and whatever. It's really just color, and you've just got to get the colors right. It doesn't really matter how you think about it. But certainly this is a good way to kind of understand what's happening with color, and how you can sort of think about how to get gray tones of a certain image, of a certain color and stuff. So again, here you can see there's going to be this hue thing is jumping all over the place. But the values are not staying that much. A lot of these are kind of pastel kind of values. It's kind of not really dark. There's nothing here which is really dark. Again, that's like 70. This up here is like looks really dark, but it's just a 60 with a really saturated blue. Here it might got some sort of dark colors, but in general, it's pastels, but the color is very different. See, blue, sort of red, massive color shift. Down here you've got some serious greens popped in there, massive contrast. And some of them are quite dark, but again, it's hard to say whether that's a JPEG aberration until you actually see these paintings in real life. It's very hard to judge what's going on. But anyway, so that's the basic that's a practical application of how color is relative. Again, it's one of those things where everyone's like, oh yeah, I've seen the color thing. But no, you actually have to look and see that, this is all the same paint. It's just mixed with black and white, and the person knows what they're doing. Whereas this one is just all sorts of crazy tubes, but the person knows what they're doing. And so they're creating that sense of light and space and of presence of the painting. And they're making these into a painting. It's not just like a rendering of person with an umbrella, person sitting on the ground, or a bunch of people in a room. It's a painting because there's significant stuff happening with the color and the value and all of those things to actually bring it to the next level and make it one of these paintings that actually kind of means something, but because it's playing with all these elements, and it's using these elements to help the narrative and communicate what the artist wants to communicate.